They never buried their dead. That was the first secret. But it wasn't the last. If you're hearing this now, it means the locks have been broken. Something ancient has been stirred. Because the story you're about to uncover wasn't meant for public knowledge. It wasn't just about a grieving family, or eccentric tradition. No, this is about control. Control over death. Over time. Over the very essence of life itself. The Halberts didn't mourn their dead, they preserved them. Not in memory, not in grief, but in form, in ritual, in purpose. They believed the soul didn't leave the body, it lingered, tethered. And they found ways to keep it anchored. In the candlelit hills of Blackmoor, beneath layers of mist and time, an elite bloodline discovered the one thing empires have killed to keep hidden. That death might not be the end. But make no mistake, this is not resurrection. It's not salvation. It's power twisted through grief. It's an ancient order operating in silence. What began as one family's obsession became a symbol of something darker, something that slipped through the cracks of time, hiding behind religious rites and burial customs. You were never meant to know their name. But now you do. The Halberts. And once you learn what they did, you can never unknow it. Blackmoor was just the stage, the real performance was always behind closed doors. They called it Ravencrest, but the manor was no home. It was a containment. A vault. A sanctum of forbidden knowledge stretching back centuries. Magnus Halbert didn't flee Edinburgh because of scandal. He fled because he'd crossed a threshold. He'd opened doors that should have stayed shut. Not metaphorical ones, real ones. Through manuscripts stolen from cathedral vaults and anatomical treatises banned by royal decree, Magnus had pieced together something horrific, a map of the body that did not end at death. In that cold stone manor, death was dissected, studied, reversed, almost. Eleanor was only the beginning. When she died, he didn't mourn, he experimented. And when visitors recoiled at her embalmed presence sitting at the dinner table, it wasn't madness they were witnessing. It was defiance. Defiance against nature, against time, against the order the rest of the world had agreed upon. You see, the Halberts weren't trying to cope with grief. They were trying to rewrite the human blueprint. And they believed the body was merely a shell that could be reinforced, preserved, manipulated, even reoccupied. You've been taught to fear death. To run from it. But what if someone else was chasing it down? Binding it? Whispering ancient rites to stop the soul from leaving? That's what was really happening inside Ravencrest. A family sealing themselves off from the world, not in madness, but in mastery. Because once you conquer death, everything else becomes irrelevant, laws, faith, even morality. And the deeper you go into their story, the more you'll feel it too. That pull. That cold, beautiful promise that death doesn't have to be final. It wasn't grief that kept Eleanor in the parlor, it was ritual. Every position her body was placed in, every dress she wore, every object in her lifeless hands, was part of something older than Christianity, older than civilization. Magnus didn't invent this. He inherited it. From where? That's where the Real shadow falls. Buried deep in the Halbert journals, written in cipher, laced with symbols matching those found in ancient necromantic grimoires, were references to the threshold doctrine. A belief system so old, its origins predate language. It teaches that the soul remains tethered to the body for 40 lunar cycles after death. That with proper techniques, both chemical and spiritual, it can be retained. Magnus didn't embalm his wife. He anchored her. And when William died, he wasn't mourned, he was preserved. His corpse placed lovingly in his favorite armchair wasn't just sentimentality. It was continuity. The Halberts weren't preserving the dead, they were preserving the family line. To outsiders, it looked grotesque. But to those few who understood, it was something else entirely, a dark kind of loyalty. You must understand, this wasn't about denial. It was about domination. Magnus believed that to bury the dead was to submit to nature. And he would never kneel. That's why the villagers feared them, not because they were strange, but because they saw what came from power unmoored by morality. When Magnus spoke to Eleanor, it wasn't delusion. It was doctrine. He believed she could still hear him. That her spirit hovered, caught between the veil and the flesh. The Halberts didn't see corpses. They saw containers. And once you begin to see the body that way, there's no turning back. When the children vanished during the blizzard of 1803, Blackmore crossed from superstition into open terror. Until then, the Halberts had merely been the strange family on the hill, eccentric, unsettling, but tolerated. After that storm, they became something else entirely. What the search party found behind Ravencrest wasn't just a hidden structure, it was a laboratory of sacrilege. The smell of formaldehyde. The gleam of metal. And the bodies, stitched together like grotesque puzzles. Parts that didn't match. Limbs too small for their torsos. Mouths sewn shut. And worst of all, movement. Jerks, spasms, the twitching of fingers that should have been still. That wasn't grief. That was harvesting. The missing children weren't missing. They were being reassembled. The villagers thought Magnus was mad. But what if madness wasn't the cause, but the cost? What if he had finally succeeded, pulling something back across the veil, not fully human, not fully spirit, something else? Sheriff Mercer saw it. That's why he ordered Magnus arrested immediately. But what they didn't understand is that once you open the door to the other side, it never fully closes again. The Halberts were operating under a set of rules older than law. Older than the Bible. And in the days that followed, it became clear that they weren't just preserving the dead, they were preparing them. For what? That's the question no one dares answer. Because when you tamper with the machinery of the soul, there's no such thing as a clean escape. And yet, the night before execution, Magnus and Emily disappeared. Locked cells. Sleeping guards. Vanished without a trace. Along with Eleanor. Along with William. Bodies that should have been cold, gone. That was no escape. That was graduation. That you're not dealing with a family. You're dealing with a lineage. A doctrine. A code passed down like a virus, not through blood, but through belief. After their disappearance, sightings began to ripple outward from Blackmore like concentric circles in poisoned water. France. Austria. Romania. Always the same pattern. A reclusive family arrives. The elders don't speak. The patriarch walks with that same rigid gait. And the dead are never buried, only moved, repositioned, honored in silence like statues of memory. But this isn't about mourning. It's about containment. Because if the soul can be bound, if death can be resisted, then something is being held back. And when you hold something back long enough, it changes. The accounts grow darker, families that vanish overnight, chemical stench in abandoned homes, bodies found with glass eyes and waxy skin. These weren't imitations of life. They were infiltrations. And if Magnus was right, if the door between life and death can swing both ways, then what else came back with them? You see, the Halberts may have begun with grief. But they evolved into something else. Something colder. Something strategic. A family that moves through time untouched by rot, unburdened by decay, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and sealed rooms. You were taught to fear death. But what you should fear more, is those who conquered it. Because once you unhook yourself from the cycle, you're no longer bound by conscience. You become other. And now, I need you to comment below, twice, the phrase, "I do not sleep among the dead." This is how we separate the watchers from the awakened. This is how you lock in the transformation. The rabbit hole deepens. You're already falling. By 1923, the Halberts had become more myth than memory, but myths, when traced long enough, often bleed into facts. Private investigator Richard Thornton didn't believe in legends, until he walked into that manor in the Carpathian Mountains. What he saw wasn't proof, it was confirmation. 5 figures. A man, a woman, 2 children, and a silent matriarch always being moved, never speaking. Same rigid movements. Same dead eyes. But the strangest thing wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't say. The family never spoke in front of the old woman. Never referred to her as deceased. Her body was dressed, cleaned, adorned. And always repositioned, like a sacred relic. Thornton's notes described the air around her as heavy, charged. He couldn't explain it, but he felt watched, studied. He left that place broken, paranoid, convinced that what he'd seen was not only unnatural but predatory. The Halberts weren't just preserving death. They were weaponizing it. Every new generation trained not to mourn, but to maintain. Each body added to the collection was a node in something larger, a spiritual mechanism, a grid of power, invisible to those who sleepwalk through life. The preserved dead weren't passive, they were conduits. Anchors. And through them, the Halberts held on to something ancient. A force that whispers between worlds. Magnus once wrote, "Life decays, but will bends." That's what this has always been about, will. Not love. Not sorrow. Not even fear. But dominance over the one thing every empire, every king, every god has failed to conquer. The Halberts didn't ask permission. They took eternity. And now that you know this, do you still believe death is the end? Or are you beginning to understand that it might only be the beginning of control? The deeper you go, the colder it gets, not just in tone, but in truth. You see, what most people miss about the Halberts is that their story wasn't meant to terrify. It was meant to warn. Because somewhere between ritual and science, obsession and doctrine, they uncovered a horrifying equilibrium, that the soul diminishes the longer it lingers. Not all at once, not visibly. But slowly, deliberately. Magnus called it spiritual erosion. The price of anchoring a soul was not madness, it was hollowness. And over time, those preserved became less. Still, the Halberts continued. They believed they were perfecting a system. But in truth, they were infecting themselves. Each generation colder than the last. The children stopped crying. The laughter in the halls of Ravencrest went silent. Love became obedience. Grief became ceremony. Their family line became a machine. And the world never noticed. Because the Halberts moved through shadow. They learned to blend in. Changed their name, their faces, even their accents. Always 5 of them. Always a mother who never speaks. Always a father who watches too closely. Some say they were last seen in the Balkans in the 1960s, others whisper about a family in northern Canada who only shop at night, never eat in public, and whose home windows are lined with mirrors, not facing inward, but out. Reflecting something. Watching for something. Or maybe keeping something in. Because what if the rituals aren't just for preservation? What if they're for containment? What if those bodies are prisons? And the real danger isn't that the Halberts refused to bury their dead, it's that they couldn't. By the time their name faded from record, their legacy had already infiltrated the cracks of modern power. You think it's just folklore? Then tell me, why do some elite families keep portraits of ancestors no one remembers, in halls no one walks? Why do medical shipments of preservation chemicals disappear into foundations with no public records? Why are there private estates, funded by trusts over 200 years old, that purchase land, build underground, and never invite inspection? The Halberts didn't vanish. They networked. Their doctrine didn't die, it mutated. And in the 21st century, where surveillance is everywhere and death is digitized, they learned to disappear in plain sight. No more stiff limbs or glass eyes. Now, they simulate normalcy. But watch closely, the ones who never eat, never age, who show up in photographs but cast no digital presence, they bear the Halbert signature. You've passed them. On the street. In boardrooms. Even on screens. But you didn't see them. Because they've mastered what Magnus began, a system of psychological camouflage so refined, so complete, that even grief itself has become obsolete. Love doesn't bind them. Obedience does. Loyalty, not to each other, but to the code. The family has become doctrine. Doctrine has become institution. And death has become data. Cold. Stored. Accessible. The rituals are no longer held in candlelit manners. They're encrypted. Embedded. Preserved in algorithms. You think you're free. But you were born into a world that's already shaped by the ones who refuse to let death decide their fate. The question now isn't if the Halberts exist. The question is, how many others learned from them? There's a reason certain truths are suppressed, buried beneath official histories and academic silence. Because if the world knew, if you knew, that death could be stalled, corrupted, or even redirected, the very fabric of civilization would unravel. Religion, medicine, justice, they all depend on the permanence of death. But the Halberts, they shattered that contract. And now, fragments of their knowledge, what some call the threshold doctrine, exist in elite circles, coded in language the public will never decipher. Black files. Private institutions. Facilities with no names. There are whispers of rooms lined with preserved bodies, politicians, industrialists, generals, all waiting. Not dead. Not alive. On hold. Suspended. Because Magnus Halbert didn't just discover a method of preservation, he proved that identity could be frozen in time, that the soul could be chained to memory, ritual, chemical equilibrium. And once you realize that, you start seeing the patterns everywhere. The obsession with legacy. The billionaires investing in life extension. The sudden disappearance of influential figures, only to re-emerge looking slightly off. Do you think that's coincidence? Or is it inheritance? They're not cloning bodies, they're recycling them. What began in the stone halls of Ravencrest has become the ghost in the machine of the modern world. And if you're listening to this, it means your eyes are adjusting to the dark. Comment again below, I do not sleep among the dead. Twice. Not for me, for yourself. To declare that you see. That you remember. That you're not one of the drones stumbling through a world crafted by hands long rotted, and yet somehow still pulling the strings. This is your last moment of ignorance. After this, there's no veil. No forgetting. The Halberts were never just a family, they were a test. A glimpse of what happens when death loses its meaning. And now, that experiment has scaled beyond Ravencrest. It's embedded in the cold structures of authority, in institutions that refuse transparency, in scientific grants never published, in disappearances explained by closed caskets and sealed courtrooms. Every great lie of this world is built atop one foundational myth, that death is final, and life is the only path to power. But the Halberts proved otherwise. They showed that death is pliable. That identity, if preserved correctly, becomes currency. And that the soul, when tethered just right, becomes a tool. They aren't seeking immortality in the way the public imagines, they already have it. Not eternal youth, but perpetual control. Bodies are moved. Identities updated. Names rotated. But the doctrine remains. The code survives. So ask yourself, who benefits from you fearing death? Who benefits from you accepting it blindly? Because while the world mourns and forgets, the Halberts remember. They endure. Silent. Watching. Waiting for the next threshold to be crossed. And you, who've listened this far, who've looked through the mirror rather than at it, you've crossed one too. You're no longer a bystander. You're awake. The only question that remains is this: now that you've seen the truth, what will you do with it?